Another commonality related to that is that people commonly say there were colors far beyond our color spectrum, like colors they can't even describe, and every shade of color that you can imagine. And the colors on Earth are the breakdown of the lights of the spectrum of the sun, the light spectrum of the sun. But if this light, as the scripture says, is the glory of God, the light of God, then of course the breakdown of the light spectrum of the glory of God is going to be far more colorful than Earth. And that's just one little example of how what NDEs commonly say is this life is the shadow.
Welcome to the show today, folks. I have a very special guest. Man, this topic that he's an expert on, he's done so much research, is about near-death experiences, about heaven, and even the flip side, hell. Pastor John Burke, he's pastor down in Austin at Gateway Church. He has written a book, Imagine Heaven, and as always, we'll put this in the show notes for everybody ordering a book. Right there, Imagine Heaven, Near-Death Experiences, God's Promises, and the Exhilarating Future that Awaits You. So, John, welcome to the program, brother.
Oh, thanks for having me on, Ken.
Yeah, so I know from reading the book, which I loved, that you didn't start out a believer at all.
No.
You started out, you were a engineer, kind of lived for party to party. Kind of life was good. You were studying engineering, and the gospel and Jesus was nowhere to be found, was it?
Yeah, I have always been kind of a skeptical, analytically minded person, which is why I gravitated toward engineering, problem solving. And my dad was dying of cancer, and someone gave him the very first research on near-death experiences, the book that actually coined the term. And for those who don't know, a near-death experience is when someone clinically dies, like their heart stops beating, their brain waves cease within a matter of seconds, and yet when modern medicine resuscitates them, or miracle, because some, quite honestly, come back within minutes, some it's hours. But when they resuscitate, they talk about an experience of a life to come more real than this life. And I see this book, as my dad's dying of cancer. I see this book that someone gave him. I read it in one night, and I said, man, maybe there's evidence for this afterlife God stuff. Because I really just didn't care at that point. But, we all get wake-up calls at some point in life, and that was kind of mine. My father dying of cancer was not in the plan, according to John. And so it got my attention, and that set me on a path of just curiosity. I mean, that's just the way I am. I'm just curious. I always want to understand why. And I ended up years later going from a career in engineering actually into ministry because of what I had learned. And my wife and I actually started a church for skeptics and doubters like myself, because it always bothered me that I couldn't find a place to ask hard questions and get good answers. So like the blind faith thing, that never really worked for me. I mean, I wasn't opposed to faith, but faith is trust, and trust in what, just because I say it's so doesn't mean it's so. And so, but this gave me more and more evidence. And so the more research I did, and it's been 35 years of researching. I've studied thousands of these near-death experiences. And I was always just curious. And so my big curiosity was, how do these relate, and especially the commonalities of these experiences? Because I've studied these experiences from all over the globe, and they have commonalities to them. And so my question was always, well, how do these commonalities then relate to what the Bible said all along? And that's what I'm showing in Imagine Heaven, is this incredible overlap of what these people are saying. It doesn't matter their background or religious culture. They're saying the same things. The similarities are uncanny.
Yeah, I find it interesting. Like in the book, I mean, there's so many stories. I mean, it's in such wide backgrounds. I mean, from a 4-year-old kid to a tenured college professor to a medical doctor to, I mean, even a preacher. Okay.
And I like to point that out because a lot of people, you know, it's okay to be a skeptic, you know, because I think it's healthy to ask questions, you know,
Yes.
and a question. But sometimes you can just be dismissively skeptical, meaning you're not really going to check into it. You're just going to, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what I found is the more I studied this, you know, in chapter 2 of Imagine Heaven, I write about skeptical doctors and the afterlife.
Yeah.
And I'm talking about what convinced me, but it also convinced many skeptical cardiologists and oncologists who, when they started interviewing their patients, they found that many of them, well, really about 1 out of 25, the Gallup poll found that 1 out of 25 Americans has had a near-death experience. So this is not uncommon. We're talking about millions and millions of people. More recently, I think it was in like 2019, the European Academy of Neuroscience published an article, a study of 35 countries that found an even greater prevalence of people claiming to have near-death experiences. So you're talking about millions of people all over the globe. And there have now been over 900 scholarly articles in peer-reviewed journals like the American Medical Association, JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, The Lancet, Europe's most prestigious medical journal, Psychiatry, 900 scholarly articles written about near-death experiences. And the reason is because there's actual evidence there. So what convinced me and many skeptical doctors as well is when people die, they talk about how they left their body, but initially they still had a spiritual body. They were still themselves. And in fact, not with 5 senses that many of them say, more like 50 senses, you know, or blended senses, your senses on steroids. And that's why they come back saying things like, I was more alive, I was more myself than I've ever been. One guy recently that I interviewed said, going from that life back again was like being put back into the sewer. And they don't want to be back. But the interesting thing is that when people are first out of their body, they are usually still in the room watching their resuscitation or watching the scene of the accident or whatever happened. They're unconscious, and yet when they come back, they claim to be able to make observations from up above watching that they couldn't have otherwise known. And there have been scientific studies done on, you know, comparing the observations made of people claiming to have near-death experiences with those who have just, say, had a cardiac arrest but didn't claim to have a near-death experience. And they found that 92% of the observations of the NDEers were 100% correct. Another 6% were mostly accurate. Only 2% were inaccurate, compared to those who had not claimed to have had this near-death experience. And it was more like what they would have seen on ER, and it wasn't close. It was guessing. So that's, you know, that's evidence. That's actual factual evidence that there's something real that these people are experiencing of a world beyond this world. The way I like to describe it is, after you know, interviewing hundreds and hundreds of these people, imagine if your life is being lived on a flat black and white painting in your home. And when you die, you know, death means separation. So our spirit separates from our body. So imagine your two-dimensional form is peeled off that flat black and white canvas and brought out into this room of three-dimensional space, which was all around you all the time, but you couldn't even conceive of it because you had a side to side and a up and down, but you didn't even have in or out. There was no third dimension. So you couldn't even understand where you are, but your two-dimensional world was contained in this greater dimensional world. And then imagine experiencing three dimensions and color, and then you're pressed back into a flat black and white painting. And you have to describe a three-dimensional experience of color, but in black and white two-dimensional terms. I'm convinced that's what these people are trying to do. That literally where we go is dimensions beyond what we experience here. That this is actually the limited experience. That's the expanded experience.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And one of the things I think that is really interesting too is these doctors and nurses and medical people. I think it was one of the stories, and there's so many in there, so many great stories, but you couldn't have known this information. This man passed away, had an NDE, and it was about his dentures. His dentures were lost. He didn't know where nobody could find his dentures. They knew that they had taken his dentures, but he told them, if you'll go do something, and there's no way, intellect because he's out of it. He's gone.
That article was actually, that example was published in The Lancet in Europe. Dr. Pim van Lommel, who I interviewed in the book, he actually writes about this guy who was brought into the ER in Holland, and he had been found dead in a park, or no heartbeat. And they go to shock him, but they found he had dentures and they need to put, a ventilator. Yeah. So the nurse takes out the dentures, puts it in the lower drawer of the crash cart. They shock him, but he never comes to in the ER. He comes to a week later in another room, sees that nurse and says, that nurse knows where my lost dentures are, then describes everyone that was in the room, said he was there watching, perfectly describes who was there and how that nurse took his dentures and put them in the lower drawer of that cart with all the bottles. And that's where they found them. And those are the kinds of observations. Another woman that I report on who was in London, she leaves her body. She was bleeding to death during childbirth, afraid she lost her child, and again rises up and she's watching the doctors work on her. And then she goes on in the experience, through this tunnel and encounters God. And those are other commonalities of the experience. But when she comes back, she again passes through the ceiling and she comes to, and she tries to explain to the nurses and the doctors what had happened. And nobody will listen to her. And finally, she explains to this nurse that another nurse or doctor that was in a green smock instead of a blue smock or something like that, and then says, go get a ladder and check on the top side of the ceiling fan, and you'll see a red sticker. And she describes this red sticker in detail. It was like the manufacturer's sticker on the top side, the ceiling side of the ceiling fan. And finally, the nurse gets an orderly. They go check it out. It was exactly what she said. So there are things like that, but there've also been studies done of those types of observations. And that's what's convinced many people that, this is not just a hallucination caused by, anesthesia or other medications or drugs. It's not just the dying effects of a brain. It's not the same as a DMT experience. All those things. And I've got a new book coming out in November of this year called Imagine God. And in it, I go through all of these, people have all these alternate explanations for why you can just write off an NDE as it's this, it's that. And I show the 10 points of evidence that those alternate explanations have to take into account, and none of them do. And so, Yeah, there is strong evidence that this is real. But one of the other amazing things is just how all across the globe there are these commonalities that people experience, and they talk about the same commonalities. Now, not everyone has every one of the commonalities, but large percentages have the same commonalities of this very lucid, highly ordered experience, which, by the way, you know, a hallucination or any kind of drug induced type experience is not a more vivid, orderly, more real experience. People don't describe them that way. And yet consistently, that's what people describe of a near-death experience.
So when people are, I don't know if the terminology is correct, I guess crossing over, when they're having these near-death experiences, when they're leaving their body and they're trying to, what are these people seeing? What are they encountering when they cross over to this other side, when they're, you know, seeing light or heaven, or what are some of the things that they say?
Yeah, I'll tell you some of the commonalities. I actually, there are about 40 common descriptors of the life to come. And I found that there 38 of those 40 are found in the Bible. So this is not new. And that's quite honestly an amazing point of evidence.
Yes.
Like, how in the world could you make that up? Where you have thousands and thousands of people from all different cultures saying the same things that have been written for thousands of years. So I'll give you kind of a summary through another point of evidence, which is that when people who have been blind from birth die and have a near-death experience, they have the same experience. They can see. And that's another point of evidence that all the alternate explanations don't take into account. So I'll tell you about Vicky. She's one of 3 blind people that I report on in Imagine Heaven. And she kind of gives a complete descriptor of the pretty much a full-blown near-death experience. So when Vicky died, she'd never seen before. She was in a car accident, and she's up above her body at first observing, and she's looking at it. She's in the hospital looking at the doctors working on her. It's frantic. And it takes her a while to get used to the fact that she can see that this is some kind of sight.
Yeah.
And then she realizes it's herself because of her long hair and her wedding ring that had an orange blossom on it.
Yeah.
And she is trying to get the doctor's attention, but they can't hear her because she's feeling great. And she knows she's a believer in Jesus. She feels great. She knows where she's going. So she's like, forget this, I'm out of here. And she leaves. Now, so this is a commonality. By the way, let me pause a second and say, a fascinating thing is that Paul also, who wrote most of the New Testament, probably had a near-death experience. And in Acts chapter 14, he talks about when he was stoned to death in Lystra, dragged out of the city and left for dead. All his friends gather around and are praying for him. When he gets up, revives, and goes back into the city.
Yeah.
Now, the significant thing is in 2 Corinthians 12, he talks about that. I believe he's referring to that. I don't know for sure, but he says, 14 years ago, whether I was in my body or out of my body, I don't know. But I was taken up into heaven, into paradise, and saw and heard things inexpressible. And so Paul writes about these same things that near-death experiencers talk about, this spiritual body, that's a commonality. These heightened senses that are a commonality. Like, for instance, people talk about how their eyesight is like telescopic. They can see like miles, not just 10 miles, thousands of miles, and like zooming in up close. Like they'll say, I could see every leaf and every vein in every leaf on every tree, or I could zoom out and, you know, looking close to something nearby. And, you know, at first, again, I've studied these for 35 years, right? And so I would hear some of these things and I'd go like, oh, that's just weird. That's bizarre. That's not in the Bible. Right. And so it didn't match. And yet what I found over time is the more I studied, I found it actually is. It is in the Bible. So for instance, in Revelation chapter 21, it says that John, one of Jesus' disciples, is taken up into heaven, up to a very high mountain, which in chapter 8, I have a commercial airline pilot who describes seeing that very high mountain overlooking the city, the New Jerusalem. But in Revelation, John is up on this very high mountain, and yet he can read the names on the foundation stones of the city. How?
That's good. Yeah.
With this telescopic eyesight. So these heightened senses, communication is some describe it as telepathy, but it's more than that. It's thought to thought, it's heart to heart, it's feeling with past and present. It's this perfect communication that people experience on the other side. So heightened senses. Vicky then describes leaving and traveling. And so she travels up through the hospital, out of the hospital, and through like space. And some describe that and going like supersonic speed. Others describe going through a tunnel. Some describe it as a dark tunnel. For others, it's a tunnel of light and colors. So it's not always the same, which is interesting. But there's a transportation basically at a tremendous speed, and they come to a place that is not unlike Earth. It's a place of exquisite beauty. There are mountains, there are trees, there are forests, there's grass, there are flowers. But like Vicky, she sees this place, and she described the place she came to as like a garden with trees and flowers and all this beauty. But she said there was light, but it was light that was not like on Earth. Now, this is another commonality. Is people commonly say it was light, but it was also life and love. Love was in the light, and the light was life. And this light, Vicky said, was coming out of everything, out of the grass, out of the trees, out of the birds, and even out of this group of people coming toward her. Okay, now stop and think about this, because, and this is what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to show and imagine heaven, how these things overlap with what God's told us all along. So in Isaiah chapter 60 and in Revelation chapter 21, it says that in heaven there is no sun or moon, for God is its light. The glory of God is the light, and Jesus is the lamp, and the nations, it says in Revelation 21, will walk in that light. Now, this is exactly what this blind girl is describing, but it's also what sighted people describe. This light that is love that comes out of everything, illuminating everything with this vividness that, quite honestly, I can't imagine it. But they talk again about how it's just the most extravagant experience. Now, think about it. Where would a blind person on Earth who'd never seen before ever get the idea that light shines on out of things? They would have heard, listening, that light shines on things.
Sure.
And so again, it's one more point of evidence, right? Then Vicky sees, these are more commonalities. Another commonality related to that is that people commonly say there were colors far beyond our color spectrum, like colors they can't even describe, and every shade of color that you can imagine. And the colors on Earth are the breakdown of the lights of the spectrum of the sun, the light spectrum of the sun. But if this light, as the scripture says, is the glory of God, the light of God, then of course the breakdown of the light spectrum of the glory of God is going to be far more colorful than Earth. And that's just one little example of how what NDEs commonly say is this life is the shadow. That's the real thing.
Yes.
And so Vicky goes on. Another commonality is that people have this welcoming committee. that comes to them, a group of people that have passed on before, usually their relatives, their close friends. And by the way, Jesus talks about this in John 13. He says, use your worldly possessions and resources to make friends so that when it is all gone, they will welcome you into eternal dwellings.
Yeah.
And he gives us a hint at that. So here comes this welcoming committee. And one of the people is Vicky's grandmother, who had died previously, and two of her close friends, Debbie and Diane. They were 9 and 11 years old when they died. They lived with her in the house, you know, with a house mother. They had significant other problems when they were alive, but Vicky said they were healthy and in their prime. Now, interestingly, that's another commonality all around the globe, is that people are commonly, they say everyone is about 30, which is interesting.
Yeah.
Now, another commonality is that people can appear to us at the age we last remember them. So it's kind of like they can choose to appear to us as we would feel most, I guess, reminiscent with them. But the majority of people appear in their prime. I don't know, 29 was a good year for me, so I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
And then she sees this light over her shoulder and turns, and here is a light brighter than the sun, she says, but not hard to look at. And she knows this is God. Now, this is another commonality as well, that all across the globe, people experience the same God. And it's not necessarily the God of their religious expectations, but it's this God of brilliant light. And they say, think of 1,000 suns, but, and many times NDEs say, I knew that if I were on earth, it would burn my retina in a second. And yet it wasn't hard to look at. It was mesmerizing to look at. And this is not a force, this is a person. Because with this light comes the most indescribable, unconditional love. Someone I just interviewed the last week, she said, think about all the love you've ever experienced from grandparents, from parents, the love you've ever had for a child, the love you've ever had for a lover or a spouse. Put it all into one moment, multiply it by 1,000,000. And she said, it doesn't even come close. And that is commonly the experience that people have in the presence of this God. So Vicky experiences this, and she knows this is Jesus. In fact, in the light, she sees this man with shoulder-length hair and a trim beard and a robe with a sash, a gold sash. And it's kind of crazy because I wouldn't necessarily expect people to describe Jesus just like you kind of stereotypically think, but they do.
Yes.
And she runs to him and she hugs him. And this hug, she said, is deeper than any hug you've ever had on earth. She can feel his beard on her face. She said little points of light were coming out of his beard. So this is, you know, this is not Jesus just like, you know, Sunday school Jesus.
Right.
This is the resurrected Jesus. And again, this is a commonality all across the globe. Then in God's presence, another commonality, which Vicky also got, is God gives them a life review.
Yes.
And so he says, let me show you your life. Now, another commonality is time doesn't work the same on the other side. So some NDEs say there was no time. Others say, well, there was time, but we had all the time we ever needed. And after hearing enough of them talk about it, I think it's actually what Peter says in the New Testament in 2 Peter 3:8, where he says, to the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day. And in Imagine Heaven, I talk about how, you know, we experience one-dimensional time. Our time goes from 1 to 2 to 3 to 10 to 100 linearly in one direction. There's no going back, right? But if you had two-dimensional time, at each point in time on your timeline, you would have a vertical line going infinitely up. And so at every point in time, you could stay going on that timeline for as much time as you needed. And that would be exactly what NDEs describe. So they're describing what I mean, it's a theory, but might be two-dimensional time instead of our one-dimensional time. So in that, they can get a life review and they re-experience their whole life, or many significant points of their life. And they're seeing their life review. It's like they're watching their life replay, but in that experience, they're watching themselves in every interaction. They're remembering their thoughts and their feelings, but they're also able to experience the thoughts and feelings of the other people they interacted with. And they come back saying two things. They know that God is love, and they know that the way we treat one another, or the love we show to one another, is what matters most to God. That's what he's commonly showing them. And it's not the same for everyone. It's very interesting. One of the things I've taken from these NDEs, which should be obvious, is that God is incredibly creative.
Yes.
Incredibly creative. And also he likes story and he likes parable. And so he makes it unique and different, a little bit different for each person, but similar enough that they're common too, right?
Right.
And so in this, at times he shows people that every little act of kindness, I mean, he basically illustrates Matthew 25, where Jesus says, he says, you'll come before the king, and he'll say to those who are righteous, or the righteous will say to him, when did we show you kindness? When did we bring you a meal? When did we clothe you? When did we feed you? When did we visit you in prison? He'll say, when you did it to the least of these brothers of mine, sisters of mine, you did it to me. And he's basically showing them the ripple effect of every little act of kindness and how that made an impact on humanity. Or at the same time, people also, when they're seeing their life review, they commonly say, God wasn't judging me, I was judging myself. God was loving me with unconditional love, supporting me, but I was judging myself. And this is interesting because people have used that to say, well, this then is not the God of the Bible, because that God is judgmental. He's judging. He's a judging God. And the interesting thing is, Jesus actually said, by your own words will you be condemned, by your own words will you be acquitted. So he actually said the very thing that NDEs experience in this life review. And what God also has said is that Jesus came and died for all our sins so that grace can be given to anyone who wants it. Forgiveness is a free gift of God. That's what people are experiencing, that God is willing to forgive and take the payment, but they know the reality of their wrongs and they know what they deserve. It's crazy. I mean, here in this world, we can play games. We can say, well, I was justified because. When you get on the other side, there's no justifying. But at the same time, Jesus said in John chapter 13, right after that most famous verse, God so loved the world, he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him would never perish, right? But would have eternal life.
Yeah. And
then right after it says, because God didn't send his son into the world to condemn or judge the world, he sent his son into the world that through him it might be saved. So that's why this is the very God that people are experiencing all around the globe. It's a commonality. So this God who loves every person he created with an exquisite kind of love, who actually is willing to offer forgiveness and grace and no condemnation, but also where our good and bad is laid bare.
Hmm.
And in Imagine Heaven, you hear it from everyone, the same testimony that they saw it all as it was,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in the life review, they saw their motives, and like you say, it was laid bare to them. There was nothing to hide.
Yeah,
Jesus said that, whatever we do, it's going to be exposed.
it will. Yeah,
The light's going to expose it.
right. And it's just it's proof of that. Now, the other side of that, and I quote this passage from Paul, where he says, "Judge nothing until wait instead." Because and Jesus said, we are not to judge. We can't judge accurately. But Paul said, wait until the only one who can judge accurately comes, and then everything will be revealed, every motive, every thought, every act and deed. And then it says, so that God can reward you. And this is an important point that I bring out in Imagine Heaven, is that this life review is not what, when people talk about the judgment, right? This life review is not that.
Right.
It's just a learning. These people have not crossed over. And that's a very important thing too, is there's another commonality. There's a border or a boundary that near-death experiencers knew they couldn't cross and still come back. And in some cases, God says to them, you haven't died yet, you have to go back. Or sometimes he gives them a choice. Do you want to go on to heaven, or do you want to go back? So this is an in-between. It's a taste. It's a taste of the life to come. And that's why I say, don't go form your worldview of the life to come based on what NDEers say. Right. Because they don't know after, beyond that crossing over. They're just getting a peek. But God has given us a lot of information in the scriptures about what should be expected. And that's why I'm showing how it reconciles as well. Mm-hmm. But the judgment actually that it talks about in the Bible doesn't come until the end of human history. And that hasn't happened yet. And there are two. And the first one is called the Great White Throne. Yeah. And it is, when you read in Revelation about the book of life and whose names are in the book of life, fascinatingly, a lot of near-death experiencers all around the world, even though this is not in their religious knowledge, talk about books of accounts. Yeah. And these books and this book of life. But the book of life is not the only book. The book of life is simply who has said yes to God. Now that's the amazing thing about God and what he did through Jesus, is he paid for all the debts of all humankind for all time, so that anyone anywhere who wants forgiveness, who wants relationship with God, can have it. It's a free gift. Yeah. The only thing that can keep you out of heaven is you. Mm-hmm. The only thing is your pride saying, I don't need God. I'm a good person. I've got it all figured out. I don't need forgiveness. I don't need God. And, another commonality is those who come back realizing that because love is what it's all about, God also created us with free will, because you can't have love without free will. Mm. So God truly gave us the ability to reject him, to reject his love, to reject his will, to say, my will be done, screw you, God, and go on about our lives. And there are hellish experiences as well. 23% of those who have come forward talking about near-death experiences have talked about hellish experiences. Yeah, we can't take the good and leave all the bad. You got to make sense of those too. And what people commonly say is that hell is the place where God allows the free will creature to play God. That's good. To say, I don't want God's will, I want my will be done. And it is the place where it is dominate or be dominated. terrorize or be terrorized. It's like, imagine the worst prison scene imaginable where even the guards are corrupt and everybody is just in it for self-will and self-preservation. And that's what it's like, where there is no light of God, there is no love of God, there's no hope of God. You know, people think hell's going to be a party. Well, you got it completely wrong. Because everything you've ever loved about this life is a creation of God. And when you take away God and there is not God, there is nothing good.
Yeah, for sure.
So yeah. So I have an entire chapter in Imagine Heaven. You mentioned Howard Storm. He was an atheist, tenured college professor.
Yeah.
Who dies in doing a tour in France, and after 8 hours not being able to find a surgeon for a ruptured duodenum, he dies, and he thought it was just going to be lights out.
Sure. Yeah.
And initially, he doesn't realize he's dead because he's standing there in the room and he sees this body laying in his bed, and he's confused because he doesn't know what's going on because he feels great. And this is an interesting thing. This was an interpretive key for me, is that some experiences are shallow. So at first, Howard, he's an atheist, but he feels great. He comes alive, and he's still alive. He's in this room. He can see what's going on. And then this welcoming committee of people come. They're out in the hallway of the hospital and they're saying, Howard, come with us. And he says, I'm sick. I need surgery. And they say, we know all about you. Don't you want to get better? Come with us. They're really nice. And they say, we're going to help you. Come with us. Come quickly. We have to hurry. And so he's kind of confused, but he starts to follow them thinking they're going to lead him to surgery. Well, long story short, they deceive him and they lead him into this outer darkness, just like Jesus described. It's just complete blacker than blackness. And he starts to realize they are deceiving him and they're starting to mock him and taunt him. And he tries to get away, and they start to maul him. And he realizes they're just playing with him, but they are eviscerating him. And it's really, it's quite disturbing. And I've Howard came back from that. Well, let me finish telling the story, because in it, he cries out to God and he remembers a song from his childhood. Now, remember, he was an atheist, but he remembers a song when the neighbor brought him to Sunday school, and the song keeps coming into his mind, Jesus loves me. And he now thinks it was God's way of kind of giving him a clue. Come on.
Wake up.
He hadn't yet crossed over fully, but he thinks to himself, if Jesus is real, how could he love me? I've denied him and cursed him my whole life. And yet in his desperation, he cries out, Jesus, forgive me, save me. And into this outer darkness comes this pinpoint of light, grows brighter and brighter until it's brighter than the sun, but not hard to look at. Hands reach out, pick him up, hold him. And as he bawls like a baby, starts to rub his back like a parent comforting a child.
Yeah.
And takes him out of there. And he said, Jesus, in the presence of these angels, then gives him a life review. He comes back, and now remember, he's an atheist, a tenured college professor. Tenure is what college professors live for.
Yeah.
2 years later, he leaves his tenured professorship to go to seminary to become a Christian pastor, because he studies the religions of the world and he realizes what he reads in the Bible aligns with what he experienced. His wife divorces him because she thinks he's gone crazy because she's still an atheist. He loses everything.
Yeah.
It's really like Paul. You know, people forget, but Paul, who wrote much of the New Testament, was first persecuting Christians, right? He didn't believe in Jesus. He was arresting Christians because he thought they were blaspheming God. And this brilliant God of light appears to him on the Damascus Road. This is in Acts chapter 9, I believe. Yep.
Yeah.
And he says, "Who are you, Lord?" And he says, "I'm Jesus, who you're persecuting."
Mm.
Now, a very important thing, that's another interpretive key of what's going on with these near-death experiencers. So first, like Howard, if he had just had a shallow experience, let's say he feels great, he leaves his body, he feels great, there are these nice people saying, come with him, and then boom, he's resuscitated.
Mm-hmm.
He would have come back saying, atheists go to heaven, it's all good. Hey, it doesn't matter what you believe or what you do, because he admitted, that when he looked at his life review, he talked about how sad it made Jesus because he hurt so many people. He did not live a good life. And so he would have concluded wrongly because he had a shallow experience and then interpreted everybody the same way. That's why don't just take a few NDEs and make a big theology out of it. It's a bad idea.
Yes.
But the other thing that's interesting is that, Christians sometimes are troubled that people who don't know Jesus, people of different religious faiths or backgrounds, experience the same God, sometimes just like Paul did. But remember that Paul experienced the same God of light when he was persecuting Jesus, and Jesus did not tell him what to do. That's very important, because Christians get confused. Well, if this is the God of the Bible, why didn't he give him the gospel? Why didn't he tell him, here's what you must do to be saved? You have to believe in Jesus and put your trust in him. He died to pay for your sins. If it were really the God of the Bible, he wouldn't say that. But he didn't say that to Paul.
Yeah.
And that is because he respects our free will, and he gives us a choice of whether we will truly seek God. And if we seek him, we will find him. He promises that.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. I actually have a new book coming out in November called Imagine God of Heaven. And it's really focusing in just on these encounters of God that people have had all over the globe from all different religious backgrounds. And one of them who did grow up Hindu and an anesthesiologist, he grew up Hindu, but he experiences the edge of hell. Then he cries out to God and he experiences these Christian angels taking him into the presence of this brilliant God of light and love, who he says later, I think might have been Jesus, because when he has this experience later of this brilliant God of light, he says, who are you, Lord? And out of the light steps a man with shoulder-length hair and a trim beard and a robe with a sash and says, I'm Jesus, your savior. Crazy.
Yes.
But this is happening all over the globe. And I truly believe that I don't know, I don't pretend to guess where we are in history or time. But truly it's accelerating quickly. And all over the globe right now, we can get these testimonies and evidence because of more and more people coming back from resuscitated from clinical death. And I think it's God's gift to the world. It's a greater wake-up call. Maybe as more people are, declaring, or turning away from God, at the same time, God is saying, no, don't look.
Yes.
Giving even more evidence.
Yeah, it's just another sign. I think if you really research it like you've done, or if people would really research it and look at all of the scientific information, don't just, even if you're not a believer, just research it yourself. I think you'll find, it does really match up with the God of the Bible, with Jesus, with some of the revelations that, God is light. 1 John 1:5.
Jesus said, I am the light of the world. Whoever believes in me will never walk in darkness, but have the light of life.
Yeah. And how God is, just supernaturally letting these people live. I think medical science as well, this modern medicine has come such a way to be able to revive some of these people that in the past they wouldn't have been able to come back.
And let me say this, especially if you have skeptics, or people who don't believe listening. Don't judge God by those who claim they follow him. Because, and this is what I find commonly, is it's like for many people, and like I said, I started a church for skeptics, and so we've seen many engineering skeptics, doctors, different people who are very smart scientists, and what I find a common resistance point is how judgmental and mean-spirited so many Christians have been, and quite honestly, downright mean and hateful.
Yeah.
And what I would say is that these near-death experiences are a wake-up call for Christians too.
Sure.
One of the ones for me as a pastor was a near-death experience of another pastor that I quote in Imagine Heaven. And he was a pastor of a large church and doing a lot of good, like sincerely doing a lot of good. But at the same time, he dies in surgery on the operating table. He's up above. He didn't know anything about these near-death experiences at all before this happened to him. And he's watching his surgery, and he said God was there with him, and he's feeling this incredible acceptance. Like you've never felt so at peace, accepted, such unconditional love. And he said, but at the same time, God asked me a question, and in the question, he was taking me out to the woodshed. That's what he said. And the question was this: what are the names of your children's closest friends?
Oh.
And he said, all of a sudden I was kind of brought to task because they'd been over to our house lots of times. I was really nice to them, but I didn't even know their names. I'd been so busy being a busy, important pastor, I'd not even taken interest enough in them to know these children's names.
Yeah, that's convicting.
And what God was saying is, you need to do better. Yes, you're right with me. Yes, I love you, but life is not about you proving yourself to the world. Life is about using the gifts and the time and the resources I've given you to love the people around you. And that starts with your own family and those that they're closest to as well. And so it's a wake-up call. It's a good reminder. Now, by the way, that's what Moses said, and that's what Jesus said.
Yeah, sure.
Jesus said you can summarize the entire Bible with 2 commandments: love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as much as you love yourself. And this is exactly what near-death experiencers tell us. But just because we know those words doesn't necessarily mean we get it, And so all that to say, don't judge God by people. People are fallen, all of us. And don't make this mistake of rejecting the one who is love because of others who don't act very lovingly.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Well, and I want to be respectful of your time. You've covered just about everything here. I kind of wanted to maybe talk about a couple of the 4-year-olds, that you mentioned in the book. In chapter 12, the world famous now, Tane, painter, artist, and
Akian?
Colton. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, Colton. I mean, these kids are 4 years old, John.
Yeah.
And the thing that really struck me about Colton's story was Dad, when he was talking to his dad, he's got markers. He's got markers. Now, how?
Yeah.
4-year-old.
Yeah, a little 4-year-old describing sitting on Jesus' lap and being comforted while he's watching the resuscitation of his own body and his dad screaming at God. And he's seeing all this, his dad was a pastor, but he's screaming at God, like, how can you take my 4-year-old? And his son tells him he saw that when he comes back, but his dad was in another room in the hospital. But he's sitting on Jesus' lap. Here's another really funny one that but it just shows the humor of God too, is they were singing songs, and Jesus asked Colton, what songs do you want the angels to sing?
Yeah.
And he said, we will rock you
Nice.
by Queen. He said, no, we're not going to sing that one.
Yeah.
I thought that
Pass
was
on that.
hilarious.
Yeah.
I thought that was hilarious.
Yeah.
But yes, so when he comes back, he's describing, this experience. And he one night says to his dad, Jesus has markers. And his dad, markers, what do you mean? You mean like, like you draw with markers? Because 4-year-olds draw with markers. And he said, yeah, markers in his hands and in his feet. And he points to his hands and he points to his feet.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly his dad realizes, that Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, still bears the marks of the crucifixion.
Yeah.
And by the way, I just in this new book, Imagine God of Heaven, I interviewed a former Muslim imam from Rwanda. I was just talking to him this week.
Yeah.
And he has a hellish experience, but his mom is praying to Jesus, and I should back up. He had this mental break, and nothing had helped. The psychiatric hospital hadn't helped. His mom was actually a shaman of the goddess Bako, but his dad was a sheikh and he was an imam. So they prayed the Quran over him. Nothing helped. And then a friend of the mom said, "You've tried everything. Why don't you try Jesus?"
Yeah.
So in desperation, the mom takes him to the Anglican church, who fast and pray together for a week. And Swidik is healed of the mental break. And the next year he gets blood cancer and dies of the blood cancer. He starts in a hellish experience. And then in the midst of this hellish experience, this man in a white robe, the beard, light shining out of him like the sun, comes in and holds up his hands, and he sees the holes in his hands. And Swidik, when he was younger, had accidentally gone to a movie. He'd gotten movie passes to 3 movies. And one of the movies that he went to, because he wanted to get his money, was The Passion of the Christ.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And so he had seen that, and seeing the holes in his hands, he realized this is Jesus. And then he said to him, "I died for mankind. You are among those I died for. Don't deny it any longer and tell everyone." And today he is a Christian pastor, an Anglican pastor in Rwanda. And it has been costly. He's had 7 attempts on his life because he converted from Islam to follow Jesus.
Yeah.
So we're talking about people, in my book, I've got spine surgeons, college professors, CEOs, lawyers, bank presidents. And you're talking about people who have nothing to gain and a lot to lose by talking about these stories. That's another point of evidence. How do you explain why?
Yeah, there's nothing to gain for so many of the. There's really something to lose for the vast majority of them.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, there's no way. Well, maybe just close us out, John, with a word to viewers or listeners. Kind of an invitation, or talk a little about Jesus to them for a minute or two here, and then maybe tell people how they can get in touch with you.
Okay.
Website,
Yeah. So let me say first, to those who are like I was, still skeptical, wonder whether there is a God and not sure about the whole Jesus thing, is I would say this, that if you're willing to be open-minded, that's it. If you're willing to be open-minded and truly seek, you're going to find that it's going to blow your mind how much evidence there really is. And go to the appendix of Imagine Heaven as well, because I put some other evidence that convinced me. In the new book, Imagine God, I go deeper into that, but there's lots of evidence. And what I would say is, just consider it. If it were true that there is a God who knows you better than you know yourself, created you for a purpose, and the main purpose was a love relationship with God that would go on forever, and that to make all your relationships go on forever in his love, why would you want to reject that? That's the first question to answer. Like, what really is going on inside of me that I wouldn't even take the time to really search it out? I think that's a good starting place. And then for those who are believers, I also wrote Imagine Heaven so that, because I find so many people have such a bad conception of the life to come, that they live for retirement, but they don't go any further. Yeah. And that's not a good way to live. When you really realize that this life is like chapter 1 in the whole book of life that's to come, that this life is continuous, it continues on, then it informs how not only you ought to live, but it helps you. It helps you love when it's hard to love. It helps you stay faithful when it's hard to stay faithful. It helps you realize in the sufferings of life and the trials of life that there's a purpose for this that is bigger than I can see right now. It helps you in every way live a better life. And so that's what I would say is, my prayer is for those two things, that skeptics would see what I've seen and come to know the God who, the best thing that ever happened to me. And that those who already believe would start to live in light of eternity, because it changes everything for the better.
That's good. Well, we appreciate your time, John. I'll put all those links in the show notes. And
and imagineheaven.net. You can get Imagine Heaven on Amazon, or really anywhere you can buy books. I am the founding pastor of Gateway Church in Austin. That's different than the Gateway Church in Dallas. So if you find that one, it's not the same. Gateway Church in Austin, it's gatewaychurch.com. I actually just passed the baton of leadership. So if you see a guy named Carlos Ortiz speaking, no, that's not me. That is the new senior pastor, but I'm still there, and I'll be speaking periodically. But you can see past messages I've done in our archives and things like that.
You have like one church, but it's like you have 5 or 6 locations down in the Austin area?
Yeah, 6 different locations around Austin, and then we have networks of people meeting globally, really all over the world. Really trying to just provide a community where we say doubters are welcome. Come as you are. There are no perfect people allowed. And instead of playing that game, we say just come and let's be real and honest and grow together to become who God intended. And it's a great way to live.
Amen. Well, thanks for your time, John.
All right. Thank you, Ken.